This podcast was sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family owned and operated.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever and whenever you may be listening. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vicars Crossing podcast on Zoom. The Vicars Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square and is brought to you, as always, by our good friends at A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. And once again, I'm Rob Henderson, and I'm still Rob Henderson, and I'm still the rector at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's in London.
A sweetheart.
For the day, but the day's not over yet. You just never know.
Well, you're a sweetheart of a man, too. Just a very good man. My name is Kevin George. I'm a priest and rector at St. Aidan's Church up in the northwest corner of London, Ontario, and glad to be with you all again today.
And I'm Ian, and I wish I had a long, fancy title.
Well, we can make one for you.
We could get him like a Lord of the Rings title, Kevin.
Yeah,
I would love a Lord of the Rings title.
Yeah, we'll work on that, Ian.
We'll work on that. Listeners can submit your suggestions to vicarscrossing@gmail.com. A title for Ian.
He needs
call
a
him
good wizard name or something.
He does.
I'm so down for a wizard name. That sounds great.
We'll work on that. And our special guest today in the Vicars Crossing, we want to welcome in advocate and speaker and author and activist and many other things that I'm sure we're going to learn about today. Karen Gonzalez is joining us today. Hi, Karen.
Hi, how are you all doing today?
We are good. And we want to welcome you. And you're in Baltimore today.
Yes, we're having some beautiful spring weather today.
Good. We kind of have a Baltimore thing, Kevin, going on last couple of weeks, haven't we?
Last week we talked to Emily Scott. She said it was Baltimore City. I assume it's the same as Baltimore, yeah?
Yes, so Baltimore City is unusual in the United States in that usually Baltimore City would be in Baltimore County, the way that Los Angeles City is in Los Angeles County, but that's not the case in Baltimore. So people usually differentiate Baltimore City versus Baltimore County.
Now, if you had to go meet Emily for something, how long would it take for you to get to her place?
I could walk in maybe 10 minutes.
See, we have geographically zoned in on Baltimore.
Right. And most of my geographical understandings of a lot of cities in the United States that I haven't been to, I base on baseball parks.
Yes.
Right. So how far are you from like Camden Yards?
Oh, really close. So I could walk in maybe 15 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow. Well, we know where to crash if we go to a game.
Yeah.
We know.
Yeah.
It's actually 2 blocks from the office, which is closed right now, unfortunately, the office. But normally, it's 2 blocks. Usually I would go from the office, walk over.
Wow.
Good. Well, we're so thrilled to have you here, Karen. And Kevin wants to give you a more formal introduction coming up in just a minute to our listeners. We want to talk a little bit about your book and some other things that you're involved with as well. But before we do that, we just want to check in with each other. A little bit of new news, Kevin, that we were able to get some new and some wonderful new artwork done.
Thanks to a alumna of the Vicars Crossing, one of our previous guests, Elspeth Dobman, one of the glaring errors of our original graphic, a cartoon graphic.
Mea culpa.
I ordered this thing, and at the time, I had this notion that Rob and I were going to start a podcast, and we needed somebody who was technologically advanced to make it happen. So we asked Ian, who's in my church, and Ian was like, "Oh yeah, I'm down with that. And I'll figure it out and all that." So in our own egotistical, arrogant manner, i.e. I say we, but it was probably me. I was like, I'll get a graphic with me and Rob on it because we're the stars of this thing, right? So we just need the 2 of us. But it became very quickly evident that the real man in this operation here, the guy who really makes it happen, is Ian. So we needed a redo. We need a fresher look. We need more color. So Elspeth Dobman, she took up the mantle and she spent the last 3 weeks doing this for us. And here, my friends, is the new look for the Vicars Crossing.
Look at us.
Look at that.
Look at the guy on top.
Yeah. Yeah.
With the head, he's looking
Yeah.
sharp.
He is a sharp-looking dude, I got to tell you.
He's a sharp-dressed man.
That's him. So we do have a fresh new look. So our thanks to Elsbeth Dobman for your work to give us that fresh new logo.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and a great piece of work, Elspeth. So thank you. Are you happy with your depiction, Ian?
Absolutely.
Good.
I was happy too. I wouldn't have complained if she gave me more hair, but
Well, a week ago you had a lot of hair.
I
Yeah.
did.
You hadn't had a haircut in like 3 months.
I know. I had a beard and a hair, but I finally just couldn't take it anymore. So I went in the backyard, passed the clippers to Catherine and my wife, and said, "Here, deal with this."
That's good.
Yeah.
So we did a little thing on Twitter, right?
We
Did a
did.
little poll. We were kind of wanted to find out a little bit about where people were watching the Vickers Crossing. So we this poll on Twitter. Our listeners, we know because we can track some of it. Like we get people that tune in from around the world, and we figured out that the number one country for listenership, not surprisingly, is Canada, and probably a lot of people from around the area we are in London, Southwestern Ontario, and the Diocese of Huron. Number two listenership was in the United States, so that's good. So we were asking what people thought. What country would be number three on the list? So what were the choices, Kev?
So the choices were the United Kingdom, Lesotho. Remember we had Peggy on here for Peg Mullen from her charity in Lesotho. These are all places that are on the 37 countries that tune in regularly. Ireland, so the United Kingdom, Lesotho, Ireland, or Sweden, which is number three.
Okay.
And the results are in.
The results are in. Well, let's see what we thought. Ian, what was your guess on this?
I thought it was the UK.
You thought it was the UK.
Yeah.
What was yours, Kev?
Well, I knew.
Oh, you already saw them. Okay. Because I hadn't seen them. Go ahead. See, I was going UK as well.
Well, what would you think, Karen? If you had to pick, where would our third country listeners be?
I would say the UK also. It just seems...
All right. Well, the results are in. And 46% of the people who voted said the United Kingdom. 42% said Ireland.
Interesting.
8% said Lesotho. And 4% said Sweden. The correct answer is, in fact, the United Kingdom. So we give thanks to our United Kingdom listeners.
Sweet. Hell yeah.
But not far behind that is Lesotho.
No kidding.
Sweet.
Yeah. So just by a narrow margin, we have more listeners in the United Kingdom than we do in Lesotho. But we are listened to in 37 countries across the world so far, and we're waiting to get to those other 60 odd countries. We'll get there eventually.
All right. Well, shout out to Lesotho.
So
after we're done in Baltimore, we're going to Lesotho.
Well, I got to think after this week and last week, our listenership in Baltimore is going to pick up. So that's my next question. So the Twitter question this week will be, we are listened to by, I think it's 170 or 180 cities around the world. The number one area, not surprisingly, is London, Ontario. The second is Toronto. And then third is Scarborough, which is up in the Toronto area. So those three are not surprising. I want to know what's the fourth most popular place for us in terms of being listened to. And here are your options. Boardman, Oregon. Windsor, Ontario. Dildo, Newfoundland and Labrador. Or Brampton, Ontario. Those are the four choices. So folks, get on Twitter after today. Their Twitter poll will be up. Vote next week when we sit down with Tony Campolo. We'll let you know what the number 4 city or town or village that's listening to us.
All right. Very good. Very good. And right now, too, another thing we do, Karen, is, as we said, Ian's pretty much the crux of this whole podcast anymore. Kevin and I thought it would be us, but we've been quickly learning that more people are interested in hearing what Ian has to say every week than a couple of old, priests in their midlife crises. So, Ian, it's time for our special section on the Vickers Crossing podcast, which we like to call for Ask Ian.
Ooh.
There we go. There we go.
Yeah. Well, we had a really popular, a really good response to the question last week, which came from Peter, the beekeeper here at St. Aidan's. Peter has an apprentice now in Jen, the beekeeper apprentice.
Brilliant.
She submitted, and if you want to learn more about the churchyard bees, go on Twitter or Facebook and look up churchyard bees, and you'll see about our bees who are flourishing back there this year. So, Jen, the beekeeper, wants to know, Ian, what makes you happy? What is your definition of happiness?
Because I'm happy. Got that song in my head now.
Well, I have a Newfoundland song in my head. Is you happy? You gotta be happy. You got to be 100% like you would.
What makes you happy, Ian?
My friends? I don't know. That's a really tough question because it's like happiness comes from a lot of places rather than just like one specific thing. So you can't just be like, oh, you know what makes me happy? Like a good beer. Yes, sir. Like, no, it's a lot
It makes
more
me happy.
it's a lot more like diverse than that, right? So it's, I don't know. It's hard to say right away.
So what I hear you saying is it's about relationship for you.
Well, yeah, but like I can
Like
also
with
be
your
like
friends and all that.
yeah, and then but also like what makes you happy is like good food. So it's a lot. It's like I don't know, life, I guess.
All right. Well, that's good. What about you, Robbie? What makes you happy, buddy? What's your definition
Makes
of
me
happiness?
happy. I would say that I've been having a lot of these happy moments the last couple of weeks, and I call them, we all call them, I think, these kind of aha moments. Like
not ha 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 ha.
no, not haha.
No.
Those can be happy moments too. But aha moments, things that kind of we've been talking a lot about the veil being lifted over these last couple of weeks with everything that's been going on, and seeing things differently, right?
Yes.
I think sometimes for me, when I have those moments, those are happy moments because the vision gets turned a little bit and you see things differently and kind of opens up a little bit of new life, new energy. So I certainly would point to those as happy. Something that makes me happy. There's
That's a good answer. Let's put our guest on the spot. What's happiness for you, Karen?
Well, at a basic level, it's things like remembering I have ice cream in the freezer.
All right.
Heck yeah.
When I didn't think I had any. That makes me happy. I think a good writing session afterward. Not during writing is very painful, but afterward, there's a really happy little high that I get from it. That makes me happy.
How about writing with ice cream?
Yeah, that can get
That's
messy.
euphoria.
That can get
that's euphoria. That's messy.
Well,
What about you, Kevin?
My definition of happiness is spending a Tuesday afternoon with the three of you.
Oh, wow.
This makes me happy. Yes,
What a
you
kind
too.
man. Yeah.
What makes me happy is the guest that we've had on this podcast in the last few weeks and coming forward here. For people like myself and Rob, who've been working in the church now for quite a number of years, having the opportunity to meet people who write so well and that have been so formative for us in terms of the work is really incredible. So it makes me very happy to have Karen on here today, and of course, always spend time with Rob and Ian. So I'm happy about that.
Good.
Wow.
That's great. Well, we've established that we are in a happy place, and that's
All
a
right.
good thing. And we are really happy to have Karen with us today. So would you please give a formal introduction of our guest?
I will. Last year, I don't know. I think I end up finding a lot of books being quoted in somebody else's book or article. And somewhere, and I just can't remember where, I came across a footnote that had this book, The God Who Sees. And I got on Amazon right away and I ordered it and I got the book and I just picked it up and I couldn't put it down. I just ripped right through it. It was incredible. And I've been rereading it again in preparation for today. And the book is Karen Gonzalez's book. And Karen is seeking to see and love her neighbors as God does. She's a speaker. She's a writer. You'll know her as an immigrant advocate who herself immigrated from Guatemala as a child. She's a former public school teacher and attended Fuller Theological Seminary, where she studied theology and missiology. For the last 11 years, Karen has been a nonprofit professional currently working for World Relief, which is an organization that serves immigrants and refugees. And so she's uniquely situated to see what's happening and how folks are facing what they are right now at the border, the U.S., for instance, as well as those across the country who are feeling a lot of stress and pain and illness and everything else right now, quite frankly. Her book, as I mentioned, is about her own immigration story. It's part memoir and part sort of theology, and it talks about the sacraments, which I found very helpful for me to frame it in that way, as we're a sacramental church. It's called The God Who Sees, Immigrants, the Bible, and the Journey to Belong. You'll find her, of course, on all the social platforms where she's a social butterfly, on Twitter, and she's on Instagram, and she's on Facebook. And you'll find her writing in the Mudroom and the Salt Collective. People look for Karen to come and speak. I'm sure that for you, this is a difficult time because you're not able to get out on the speaking circuit. And I know, talking to some of our guests earlier in the month as well, they were talking about, this is their bread and butter in a way too. So this is difficult when you lose these engagements. So, but she talks about spiritual formation, Latinx identity, race, culture, women in the church, immigration, the Enneagram, and she also will be found in Sojourners, Christianity Today, The Christian Century, Christ and Pop Culture. There is nowhere on the planet where you won't find Karen. She's everywhere. And so, and that is to our delight. So Karen, welcome to the Vicar. And now you can put in there and a guest on the Vicar's Crossing. A bunch of Canadians. Welcome to you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. What a welcome.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Karen, let's get right into the book a little bit here. And there's lots of things we wanted to talk about, but we've kind of picked a couple that we want to get your feedback on and thoughts about. One is story of Hagar from Genesis. So bear with me a minute. This is a bit of a long question, but I want to put it in context for our listeners too. I always tell my folks when I'm doing Bible study at my parish or in a group that, Genesis is more than Adam and Eve, right? Just keep going. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of good stuff in there. And in the 16th chapter of the book, we see the story of Hagar. And I want to read a little bit of that chapter for everyone just to put what your book is all about and where you come from in context. So from the 16th chapter, it reads, "The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, 'Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?' 'I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai,' she answered. And then the angel of the Lord told her, 'Go back to your mistress and submit to her.' The angel added, 'I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count.' And the angel of the Lord said to her, 'You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers.' She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. 'You are the God who sees me,' for she said, 'I have now seen the one who sees me.'" And you write in the chapter on Hagar, you write about Hagar's name, which translates to foreign things. And you write about how dehumanizing that must be. But you unfold that story of this Annunciation and how God sees Hagar and tends to her needs. And this is just a short quote from your book. "Hagar in the desert reminds all of us that the Spirit can be found in the places we least expect, with the poor, the outcasts, the enslaved people, the domestic help, and the foreigners. God is present with anyone who is treated as a human resource instead of a human being. God shows up not just for the master and mistress of the house and the native citizens with rights, but for the undocumented maid in the kitchen. And who would have imagined that the undocumented maid didn't bring needs for refuge or economic opportunity? Who knew she also brought gifts, faith, devotion, hard work, talents, rich cultural traditions, and a family that would grow up and integrate into the adopted country?" So, Karen, can you share with our listeners today what really grabbed you about the story, why it's so important to you, and how did it actually come to be the title of your book?
Sure, I'd love to. So, this story of Hagar, and by the way, I learned a lot about this story from Dr. Wilda Gaffney in her book, Womanist Midrash. Mm-hmm. And she's the one where I found this information about what her name is translated as, and that she wasn't even called by her first name. She was just called this foreign thing in our household. But I think what struck me most was that Abraham and Sarah themselves had been foreigners in Egypt, and they had suffered when they fled to Egypt in earlier chapters of Genesis under a famine. And then when they left Egypt, presumably that's when they Hagar came to live in their household, right? It was during this time. And when they left, they turned around and mistreated a foreigner in their own household. Mm-hmm. And I found that parallels so much. In the United States, there's this American mythology around, oh, we're a nation of immigrants and this is the great melting pot. And in the same breath that people will say that, they'll say, but the immigrants that are here today are different. They're not like my ancestors who were, noble people. And that's part why I really love that, here Hagar is the most vulnerable of people in the ancient world. She's a woman, she's enslaved, she's foreign and being mistreated. And yet God appears to her exactly as God appears to Mary in the Gospel of Luke, when she receives a messenger of God that tells her she will bear a son. In fact, the messages are almost identical, right? They're told, you're going to have a child. This is what you should name him. This is going to be this child's future. And so to me, I found that so moving that in the ancient world where Hagar was a non-person, God sees her. She's the only person in the Bible to name God. Mm. And to me, that's just really beautiful. It's like, for me, it's exactly as if, I thought about my grandmother. I mean, one of the other things I've learned about Hagar is that it's very likely that she was a dark-skinned person, that she may have looked very different from Abraham and Sarah. And I thought about my grandmother was a domestic housekeeper. She didn't have papers to be in the U.S., so she was unauthorized as an immigrant, and she worked in this wealthy household. She raised these people's children. She took care of their house and allowed them to go out and seek employment. And I don't think that they really saw her as this significant. I mean, the world at large, not this particular family, but the world at large didn't see my grandmother. In fact, she was trying not to be seen because of her status, right, in the United States. But the fact that God saw all of that God, she was only able to finally get papers the last 5 years that she was alive. And so for all this time, she was just unseen. Wow. And so I think that to me dignified for me so much of her life and her contribution, and the fact she was the spiritual mother of our family. Yeah. And she's the one that handed down faith to us. And, that there's so much significance in that for me. Yeah. So, to me, the story of Hagar is just so powerful and so beautiful for people who are oppressed and unseen.
You write a lot about your grandmother in this book. It's very clear that you had a close relationship to her and that she loved you very much. And I think one of the things I thought as I was reading it is just how wonderful it is to see the gift that your grandmother gave the world. You didn't get as you are by accident. And so as I sit, in my den reading a book and ravishing through pages and just feeling the Spirit of God alive and well, and I'm hearing about your grandmother, there's this sort of anamnesis, this sort of live memory of generation after generation that I could never know your grandmother, but somehow or another your grandmother's had an influence on me because of you. And I just think that's really powerful. And the notion of her being seen or not seen, depending on, but, I spent some time in the U.S. a few years ago doing some studies in Chicago, and I was taken by some people I got to know who had hired help. And it was alarming to me. I had never experienced it before. because they would come and go, and as you said, they would raise the children, but it was as though they weren't there. I mean, there'd be a whole conversation taking place, there'd be a whole reality, and I would extend that, well, come and sit down with us, and just sort of look at you and go, no, that's not what they're here for. They're,
Yeah.
I just sort of very difficult. How old was your grandmother when she came to America?
She was in her 50s. And yeah, so she was not a young, she was a middle-aged person when she came to be here. And yeah, really struggled to get documented, to get the papers she needed. So yeah, it's for sure. And one interesting thing about what you're saying is that there was a study done a while ago that showed that like 80% of Americans have never had a foreign person in their home who wasn't there for a transactional reason, like to provide a service.
Right. Help.
So yeah, so there's a real sense of like immigrants don't know how Americans live. Americans don't know how immigrants live, and there's a lack of relationship. Yeah.
And the other shocking part of it to me was the people who were most vocal, being anti-immigrant, were the people who had Hispanic help at home, often undocumented. And it's just, even the lawmakers, you start learning about what some of them have been up to, and you're like, well, what is this? Like, you've benefited from this sort of transactional reality that have kept people down, and you don't want to do anything to help these folks, some that you've known for decades, become citizens of your country. It's a very odd thing.
Oh yeah, they're expected to, immigrants are expected to work hard, but keep their head down, assume all the risks needed during this economy, during this health pandemic, but not complain about being blocked from public benefits or from being excluded from stimulus payments.
Right.
Just be grateful that you're here and keep working.
Wow.
That was a bit of a theme of an article that you wrote. I think it was in Christianity Today, wasn't it? It was called "I'm Not a Good Immigrant," or that was, part of that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was that was the message that you were trying to get out in that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just to sort of actually pick up on that theme of, trying to get people the right benefits and making sure that they're cared for and all of this. Another great chapter in The God Who Sees is the story of Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman, which is, to me, one of my favorite Bible passages, because it points out, we like to talk about the divinity of Jesus, but we often aren't so keen to talk about the humanity. But the church has always said Jesus is fully human. And in this story, I think we get to see in raw detail just how human Jesus could be and how we all can be. And that's really the story for me. So just a quick, for those who don't know the story, who are in our audience, I'll read this brief scripture. From there, and this is from Matthew, from there, Jesus went to the regions of Tyre and Sidon, and a Canaanite woman came from the territories, came out and shouted, "Show me mercy, Son of David. My daughter is suffering terribly from a demon possession." But he didn't respond to her at all. His disciples came and urged him, "Send her away. She keeps shouting after us." Jesus replied, "I've been sent only to the lost sheep, the people of Israel." But she knelt before him and she said, "Lord, help me." He replied, "It is not good to take the children's bread and toss it to dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall off the master's table." Jesus answered, "Woman, you have great faith. It will be just as you wish." And right then her daughter was healed. At the end of that chapter, in which you lay out the case for immigrants and their allies to speak up, you write this: "The silence of the oppressed and their allies will never topple the master's house. So we talk back to our churches, our friends, and our legislators, praying for a change of heart. Perhaps we even talk back to Jesus, asking for justice for his name's sake. It was he who told us that those who hunger and thirst for righteousness will be filled. This foreign unclean woman was seen and heard by God. She fought for her and her people's inclusion in Jesus' mission, and she got it. If the immigrant story is one of resilience, then she embodies it. There's a lot today that we can learn from her story. Most importantly, that we must speak up boldly. There are more than enough resources for citizen and foreigner alike, so we are free to welcome immigrants into our land without fear. It strikes me, Karen, in our current climate, that this hopeful message is more important than it's ever been. COVID-19 is taking the lives of Black, Indigenous persons of color and persons of color at a rate that is alarming. Brutality from the police upon minority populations has been well documented. We're in day 22 of protests now after the murder of George Floyd. And now even more of this. We keep hearing more and more, it just doesn't stop. Now it's Atlanta. These protests and demonstrations for Black Lives Matter continue to call out the authorities and call out the institutions. All the while, the occupant of your White House seems to not be listening at best, and at worst, he's using dehumanizing rhetoric to sort of stoke the flames of what we're seeing in America for political gain and votes. So with that backdrop, what does it look like now? I mean, to be that progressive and hopeful voice in America under this current political climate, what needs to come next? How do we advocate? We're hearing about defunding the police, right? Which is, which seems to mean different things to different people, but at its core, it means we need to change the system because it's inherently racist, and something different needs to happen. So where do we go from here? I'm hopeful that the traction that we see 22 days in means that something's happening. Tell us about you're just down the road. You're in Baltimore, so you're not far from a White House, really. And so tell us about what's happening. What are you experiencing in your city and in the nearby area? And as a woman who is an immigrant herself to the United States, how are you feeling? And what do we need to do? How do we be allies?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think it looks different depending on who you are. Honestly, the only hopeful thing right now is those bodies on the street who are protesting, who are making sure that people know that it's not okay that George Floyd was murdered by the police, but it's not okay that another Black man running away from the police over the weekend was shot in the back by police. And, at the same time, there are voices saying things like, well, if we defund the police, but what'll I do, if someone, steals my car? And it's a really interesting question, because I've actually had my car broken into and stolen here in Baltimore. And I called the police and they really didn't do anything.
Well, that depends. It depends sometimes who's calling the police.
Yeah.
That's the argument again.
So one time I was leaving work and I saw an African-American couple. They were fighting, arguing. It was getting really loud. He was getting a little bit physical. And I thought, I could call the police, but if I do, this could be a really terrible thing for this couple. And maybe this is how they normally fight, and so I stood across the street. I let the woman know, I'm here if you need me, or if you want me to call someone. But I didn't call the police, specifically because I didn't want a situation escalated for them. So I think right now, the hope is in all of the people who are not allowing even the arrest of the 4 police officers in Minneapolis to be the end. Because when there was a man named Freddie Gray murdered in Baltimore by the police, and as soon as the police officers were arrested and indicted, the protests stopped. And I think the community has learned from that.
Yes.
That it's not a time to stop, because in the end, those officers were acquitted, and no change has happened in our city and to its policing. So yes, I think that these calls are really important. And I think for me, that's the most hopeful part, is that these protests continue and that they've spread to other countries, even
around the world.
Hearing like the British people saying Black Lives Matter, in their little British accent. And
colonizers, no less.
And statues coming down, the Confederate statues finally being removed. I just remember my brother and I driving from Florida to California through the southern U.S. and we needed to stop for gas, but the only gas station we saw had a huge Confederate flag. And we're like, well, we're not going to stop there. We're both dark-skinned people.
Yeah.
And we don't know if that's going to be safe for us
Right.
because, And so I think all of the momentum that we have right now is extremely hopeful for me. And that's really it, to be honest with you. I don't see a lot of hope from our legislators. And this is why, I believe Jesus didn't come to the world as a diplomat to go work with Herod and try to negotiate better treatment for his people.
Right.
Change doesn't seem to come. Change seems to come from the bottom, from the people. And it's only that pressure that changes things. And so that for me is the most hopeful part of this climate. There are still a lot of protests in Baltimore and in Washington, D.C. And, one thing I'll say is I'm okay with them not even being peaceful protests because, and I know that that's hard for some people to hear, but it's not that I advocate for the burning down of a business that somebody built, but that attacking capitalist enterprises seems to be the only way that people are listening.
Mm-hmm.
People like legislators, people like the president, he finally backed off from saying really awful things for a bit anyway about this specifically. But that seems to be, when there were peaceful protests, when the NFL players, the National Football League were kneeling. I've been
resonate, right?
Yes, when I've been to city council meetings and, African-American people gather there and calmly ask and talk to their city council members, nothing happens.
Yeah.
All the peaceful protests that have been happening, nothing happened. All of a sudden, a Target is burned down and everybody's listening, and to me, it's very sad that that's what it takes, but this is what happens when we live under a system like capitalism.
This is the determination of the Syrophoenician woman.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
To speak up
and get louder. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think about the story of the woman with the judge, give me justice, keep banging on the door.
Right.
And you gotta, cause it's gotta be loud enough because usually, like you said, the other things have not been loud enough. Obviously there was a metaphor I heard the other day of someone saying it's like riding behind somebody on a bike and you're 20 meters away and you kind of yell, on your left. Then you get a little closer and they're not moving and you yell a little louder on your left. And eventually you're not listening to the point where you collide with each other.
Right.
And this is what this has been. This person was saying, we've been trying to yell on your left long enough.
For years.
And we can't now. It's just, there's a collision going on now, right? Because you're not listening.
Exactly.
I think of Bakari Sellers I see on CNN. He told a story the other day, and he was talking about this sort of persistence. And he brought up the bus boycotts, right, in Montgomery, right, Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking about how we're at that point, I think it was 20 days in, and he says, hold up, people. Like those bus boycotts lasted, and the demonstrations in the streets lasted like 360 some odd days. Like, and that's what it took. And so, you're quite right. These people, Karen, who are now demanding something more, and there are small shifts now. Like, you're hearing police chiefs talk about restructuring and defunding. Yeah. You're seeing mayors paint streets that say Black Lives Matter that you can see from outer space. Listening to the mayors that were on with Laura Coates on CNN the other night of San Francisco, Atlanta, DC, and in Florida, making incredible statements about what they're prepared to do to make change. So, but we have to keep it up. That's for sure.
Yeah, it has to continue. And I think another really great thing about this movement is it's just like the Syrophoenician woman, the Black Lives Matter movement, in the sense that, she's a woman, she's unclean. Some theologians say she's offending Jesus' honor as a man by approaching him and asking for a favor. She's doing all these things that are just not respectable, in her time. And it used to be that in the civil rights movement, they would push really respectable people to the front. People like Rosa Parks, because she was older, she didn't have a criminal record. And the Black Lives Matter movement has been pushing behind the deaths of, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, George Floyd now.
Mhm.
And I've heard people say, oh, but George Floyd may have been paying with a counterfeit bill. Like, okay, but that is not a capital crime. No one should lose their life over that. And so I love that they're not, just like the Bible didn't put forth the most perfect woman to come and approach Jesus, but rather a woman specifically that other people would have thought, well, why should she get an audience, before the rabbi, Jesus? And yet she not only speaks to him, but she kind of sasses him with this, very, very witty response. She really pushes back on him. And in the end, he gives her exactly what she asked for.
And turns from referring to her as a dog. Of dehumanizing her. Like, people gloss over that, but Jesus dehumanizes this woman and refers to her as a dog.
And I think one of the great things about that story is we see, there's a lot of debate around this story, but I think Jesus was fully human like us. Then in his culture and his time, there must have been prejudices that floated around too. And we know some of them, in fact, right? Yeah. And if Jesus didn't have to fight prejudices like we do, then was he really a fully human person, right? And the fact that Jesus learns from this encounter with this woman, I think it's one of Jesus' most human moments, and I think people don't like human Jesus.
Well, it's like if Jesus can be bathed in the culture that he's in and say the word that he said or entered into that space of dehumanizing someone, and then their voice gets him to turn to say, that I see you now as someone that is human and worthy of the healing and freedom and all that. If Jesus can go through that, like, what's that say to us who are bathed? To me, bathed in the white privilege and and all that kind of stuff. What's that say to me? Yeah.
Ian, what do you got down there in the bottom corner, buddy? You cooking something up over there?
I just agree with everything you're saying. It's amazing. It's like, heck yeah. The pause was because I was trying to think of something witty to say, but no, I was just like, everything is speaking my language. Speaking of this, you write, now please correct me if I'm wrong because my Spanish is non-existent. You write about Las Posadas.
Yes.
Sweet.
Nicely done, Ian.
Sweet. Okay. Every year from December 16th to December 16th to the 24th. Wow, I can't even speak English. Let's move on. Every year from December 16th to the 24th, Las Posadas is celebrated in many Latin American countries. Roughly translated, Posada means inn or shelter. Las Posadas recalls the events in Luke's gospel leading up to Jesus' birth. You write about how Las Posadas has also become a ritual that ministers and immigration advocates and has been used to represent the lack of hospitality at the U.S.-Mexico border. Their version is called Las Posadas sin Fronteras, a shelter without borders. Can you share with us a little bit more about the tradition and the evolution to being a cross-border ritual and what that sort of means for the people in Mexico and the people in USA?
Yeah, it's become a really powerful tradition along the border communities on both sides. And what you usually have is a group, and these are usually people of faith, but also other people join in, just people who are activists, people who care and have concern for immigrants. So you have groups gathered on the American side and groups gathered on the Mexico side. And the way that Las Posadas works is that you have typically at Christmas time, you have a procession going through a neighborhood and they knock on doors. And when they knock on a door, the person opens and, the people asking for shelter who represent Mary and Joseph sing a song. So you sing a song asking for shelter and the other person sings a song denying you, go away. Well, one of the things that they say is, go away. If you don't leave me alone, I'm going to beat you up. And so the song goes back and forth until finally they get to a neighbor who's been designated as the one who will let everyone in. and that person says yes because, they decide to practice hospitality and they inadvertently welcome the Christ child and his parents, right, into their home. And so doing this at the border with that language of asking for hospitality, I'm in need, I have people with me who are in great need, who are hungry, who need rest, and having the other side respond, go away, we don't want you, we're going to beat you if you don't leave. It's incredibly powerful and extremely relevant, to the relationship between these two communities. And then to have it end with nothing changing, that there's there's no opening the gates of the border at the end and allowing people in and celebrating together, right? This hospitality, it's really an exercise of hope, of people, longing for a world that doesn't yet exist. But it's extremely powerful and it's very moving. We did a version of it in DC a couple of years ago, and we just did it along the Capitol, inside the Capitol building room.
You could do it at a fence right now because there's one around the White House.
Oh, yeah. For sure. He built his own fence around himself in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, no irony there.
Yeah. But we did it in the Capitol building. We did this, the singing. And it's funny, we went to Mitch McConnell's office, who is, the basically the head, right? The majority representative. Yes. And do you know that we brought him a gift? You're not allowed to give legislators a gift that costs any more than $25. So we even had a receipt. And it was a snow globe of the nativity scene of Jesus and his parents. And do you know that the staff members that greeted us, not only did they refuse the gift, but they said, "Are you all from Kentucky?" And when we said no, they welcomed us to leave.
Oh my gosh.
If you ain't from Kentucky, you don't exist.
No snow globes from Kentucky coming in the mile.
Yeah, because we couldn't vote for him. They had no reason to listen to us.
If you're not from Kentucky, we'd like me to go home.
Yeah.
It's another story of doing these.
So just to clarify, that ritual is being done through the fence, through the wall.
Yes.
Right.
Through the wall. Yeah, it's done through the wall. So the way the wall is created is these tall metal slats, and they're connected at the very top. And so you can see through the wall. You can shake hands through the wall. I went to the border right before the shutdown. I was in El Paso, in Juarez, which is the sister city on the Mexico side. And there was a pastor that did a lot of the teaching of the workshop that I went to, but he couldn't get a visa to come teach. So he had to teach via Zoom. And then when we went to the border to pray, he met us on the other side. And literally we could, shake his hand through the slats, and that's it.
Wow. So, and then of course that doesn't begin to touch on the caging of children and the whole thing. It's just outrageous.
Wow. Another part of your book, Karen, I wanted to touch on was, as Kevin said at the beginning, you touch on some things about sacrament and such. And in your chapter on communion, you write a bit about Archbishop Oscar Romero, who I think is known to a lot of people, but for those that aren't familiar with the story, served as fourth Archbishop of San Salvador. And as many know, he spoke out against poverty, social injustice, assassinations, torture amid a growing war that was going on in El Salvador in 1980. And you write this in the book. Archbishop Romero saw the work of liberating the people of El Salvador, people suffering, just like their Guatemalan neighbors, as a natural extension of his faith, and he paid the ultimate price for it. One day, while the Archbishop celebrated the Eucharist, a gunman stormed into the back of the church. A single shot rang out, and Romero, who had just raised the chalice of wine, the blood of Christ, to bless it, was struck. A bullet pierced his heart. Romero's words and witness still hold truth today. I'm quoting, "A church that does not provoke crises, a gospel that does not disturb, a word of God that does not rankle, a word of God that does not touch the concrete sin of the society in which it is being proclaimed, what kind of gospel is that? Just nice, pious consideration that bothers nobody. Something else that he wrote was a Christian's authenticity is shown in difficult hours. It is in difficult hours that the church grows in authenticity. Blessed be God for this difficult hour. Let us be worthy of it. So my question to you is, the church today, we that follow the way of Jesus, are we worthy of it? Can we initiate the change that is so badly needed by being and stepping into those difficult spaces and be the church that we're called to be?
I believe we can be. The question really is, will we do it? Will we choose that path? Because I was thinking this week about the story of Esther when Mordecai, her relative, says to her, salvation is going to come. If you don't choose to be a part of it, Esther, God's going to bring it some other way. So it's her decision, right, about whether she will labor with God in this endeavor. And I think that's what that's the same question the church has. Are you going to step into this? We're already being led by people outside the church. The movement is outside the church, and we have a choice, to join in this way of Jesus to help usher in our collective liberation, our collective freedom. So I hope that we will. I think there's a little bit of momentum in the church toward that, but there's still a lot of, I think, unwillingness to really name our own sin, our own racism, our own xenophobia. So I think that's the real challenge. It's been said that everybody wants to change the world, but nobody wants to change themselves.
Right.
And
right.
I think it's that moment right now where one of the things that I've been doing in this season is sitting in the presence of God's Spirit and just really reflecting and processing the ways I live in a racist society. There is no way that I have not absorbed racism and xenophobia and anti-Blackness. And part of that journey I talk about in my book, but there are so many ways, explicit, implicit, that we receive this, that we each have to do this work of dismantling in ourselves. So then we can be part of this work of dismantling it in our society. We had to change the time of this interview because I had to go to the vet, and I didn't see my normal veterinarian. It's a little practice, and there's like 3 or 4 veterinarians. And the person I ended up seeing, I've never seen before, and he ended up being a Latino person, and he is very white passing, because being Latino is an ethnicity, not a race. So you can be white, you can be indigenous, you can be Afro. And so he was very white, and he assumed because I'm a Latina that he just started going off on this rant against Black Lives Matter and about how he wasn't a racist. He kept saying, I'm not a racist, but. And then he was talking about all the things that Latinos suffer, and how we're hard workers and all of these things, which the whole thing for me is in doubt, because he is extremely white passing, and there's no way he didn't benefit from that privilege of looking very white and speaking English without an accent and all of that. But to me, it was very representative of the way that I dealt with race for so much of my life. Instead of really acknowledging the ways that I was not anti-racist, the ways that I had absorbed racism and anti-Blackness and internalized it, and needing to really confess that and repent of it in order for God to really do something new. And I think what we're seeing in the culture is this movement. It's not coming from the church, although we're invited to join it, and we should.
Yes.
But I think it also involves recognizing and telling the truth. The church in the United States has been has a really racist history, all the way from endorsing slavery in the 16 and 1700s and even up to the 1800s, all the way to like mass incarceration, to supporting all of these really awful things that were actively supported within the church.
Right.
And so we have to tell the truth about that. We have to repent of that. But people want to skip over that piece and move straight into reconciliation, and we can't do that. And I think that's the piece that's really missing.
Yeah, so I think that's the interesting little spot, right? Like that's, so, you know, to use Romero's phrase, theology, are we worthy of this moment? If we're worthy of the moment, and we're actually concerned to do what you write in here about, you know, when you talk about the concrete sin of society, which is being proclaimed, you know, like, then it means being willing to acknowledge where we've gotten it wrong. You know, here in Canada, the church played a large role in residential schooling. We systematically removed Indigenous persons, First Nations people of this country, from their homes. We beat them if they spoke their language. We abused them. We have a terrible past for which we have to atone. And when we talk about truth and reconciliation, which is a whole process in this country, and there's recommendations that came out of a commission, the single largest thing I think we're still trying to come to grips with is our willingness to say that we're complicit in this, that we're a part of it. We still have people who want to say, well, that was then and this is now.
Right.
Well, it wasn't then. Then was 1996, the last school closed. And there are many victims alive today who can tell their stories, which are heartbreaking stories. And that systemic racism has permeated every level of our society. I shared with Karen the video of the chief in Fort McMurray who was tackled and beaten by the RCMP. We like to watch what's happening in America as a sort of almost a entertainment in a way, sadly. Like there's this whole thing happening and it's blowing up. But we've got it here. And I was glad to see 10,000 people in the streets of London here a couple of weeks ago or last week, Black Lives Matter. But we've got a lot of work to do. Anyway, Rob, over to you, buddy.
Oh, yeah.
Is it you or me?
I think it's Kevin. Yeah.
Oh, it's me. Okay.
That was you.
I got too excited. I got very excited. Once I get excited, there's no holding me back. Listen, you write beautifully. The other part of your book that really was meaningful to me was about Ruth. I love the book of Ruth. It's one of those short, beautiful books in the Bible. And you talk about Ruth and Boaz, and you posit that Ruth would not be accepted in the Canadian or U.S. At the Canadian or U.S. border today. She'd be turned back. And you say that quoting Rabbi Arthur Waskow. Is that
Waskow?
Waskow, sorry. And so you're right. If Ruth came to America today, what would happen to her? Would she be admitted at the border? One needs only a limited knowledge of the U.S. and Canadian immigration laws to know that she wouldn't. According to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, Ruth, despite her poverty, could not be classified as a refugee. Now, you're working for an organization which is ideally situated to be able to see this and know what's going on. Can you share a bit about why she would not be and what people may not know about who qualifies to be a refugee in our countries?
Sure, yeah. So I think a lot of people, I've even read theologians who classify Ruth as a refugee, and I think they mean it in a general sense, right, of someone who is in a kind of a desperate situation and fled her country. However, the legal definition is that you have to flee because you either are being persecuted or fear being persecuted under one of 5 categories: either your political opinion, and that includes even being a relative of someone who is a political leader, let's say. It has to be, war or conflict. You fear because of your ethnicity or race, because of your religion. So these are the basic categories. And Ruth, if you read the story, she's leaving because of a famine. She's hungry. She's leaving to keep her family together, to stay with her mother-in-law. We call these economic migrants. We don't call them refugees. And that's our legal definition. So if she showed up at the border and said, I want asylum, they would tell her, no, you don't have a claim to asylum. Right. I want to be a refugee. No, you can't be a refugee either. So she could do family-based migration perhaps, but really she doesn't have a close enough blood relationship because her husband is dead. It is just her mother-in-law. and a mother-in-law can't sponsor a daughter-in-law when her son has died. So she doesn't have that. There's a diversity visa lottery, which you have to have a high school diploma to get. She doesn't have that. So all of the avenues, work visa, she might be able to get a temporary work visa to do agricultural work. That's the only thing she could do potentially. But most work visas in the United States, as well as in Canada, actually go to like your surgeons and software engineers, to that level of professional laborer. So yeah, she doesn't really have a recourse. Canada has a really good point system for if you speak the language, right? If you have a degree, all of these different categories, and she doesn't have enough points to qualify.
So starving to death doesn't qualify you.
It does not qualify you.
Wow.
It does not under the United Nations definition, not under U.S. law, not under Canadian law either. So it's something that many people don't realize is true. But being hungry and wanting to keep your family together, which, by the way, are the top reasons people migrate, are not considered refugee status. People consider that, they see that as sort of a very optional kind of migration. And what I love about the book of Ruth is that you see this community welcome her. Now, in the Bible, there are so many times where God tells his people, do this, and they don't, and God sends prophets, and the people end up, receiving judgment from God because they don't follow God's commands. But this book is so beautiful to me because the people do exactly what they're supposed to do. God says, welcome the immigrant, treat the immigrant as yourself, do justice for the immigrant. This is exactly what happens in the book. And, it's a really happy book because the people trust and believe God. They do what God says, and they even go above and beyond, Boaz doesn't just provide her with work, but it's the kind of work everyone does. He doesn't say, listen, I want you to wash dirty feet because that's the work nobody else wants to do. He doesn't do that. He says, come do the work that everyone else does. Come sit at our table. Come break bread with us. Come drink from our water containers. Take Sabbath, take a day off to worship and to rest. And he protects her. He just says no abuse, no assault. Leave her alone to his workers. What Boaz does is exactly what God's law commands. And it's just a really beautiful story. And, I was taught that story as like a story about Boaz being a sort of knight in shining armor rather than as a story of like immigration. But there's a lot of migration. And, one of the hardest things is sometimes, somebody will email me and will say, oh, I really appreciated your story in your book, but I'm sorry, it's just a stretch to say there are immigrants in the Bible. And I'm like, it's literally in the Bible.
The word is used more often than they love to talk about love your neighbor, which I think is 2 or 3 references, but there's 80 references to welcoming the foreigner or the stranger.
Yeah.
Well, this is what happens when you don't know how to hold a Bible right side up. You get my meaning.
I know who you're talking about. Who was that guy?
Who was that guy? Which way does this go? I'm not seeing it.
I have a Bible. I'm in front of a church. I gas people like nobody else gasses people. I'm so good at gassing people.
Gassing people to take a picture with a Bible.
In front of one of our churches. What a clown. And then I ran the last 10 feet. Momentum. Sorry for making fun of your president.
No, not my president.
By the way, I need to say this. I got to get something off of my chest, and it's not about him. It's about the fact that people are using the word Karen in a negative way.
Oh yes.
Oh yeah.
And so we have a Karen on here today, and I have a sister-in-law, Karen, who I love very much.
Me too.
And these are wonderful people. And they are kind and generous and loving, just like Karen is here. And yet there are people out there on social media slagging the name Karen. Yep. I call for an end to this. How does it feel, Karen, to have your name abused such?
I have to say I felt slightly vindicated when a group of white women was holding up a sign at a Black Lives Matter protest that said, Karen's against police brutality. And another one said, as a Karen, I would like to speak to the manager of systemic racism.
Perfect. Yeah. Add my name to that, right,
Yeah.
Karen?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Karen's book is called The God Who Sees, and we've talked a little bit about it today, but I certainly encourage people to purchase it and read and enjoy and hear Karen expand on her thoughts around some of these things a little bit more, because it's a wonderful read, and we really appreciate that you could spend a little time breaking it apart for us today, Karen. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. Before we let you go, just a little thing we like to do with our guests before we finish up is
A fun
we call it's fun. Yeah, it's called the lightning round. A few quick questions. I want to find out a little bit more about Karen today. So if you're ready. So question number one is, you're locked in the house because of this pandemic. And I think you answered this at the beginning of the show, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What's your go-to food in lockdown?
Yeah, it's mostly been like ice cream for sure.
Yeah. We pulled out we forgot we had an ice cream maker in our freezer in the basement.
Oh,
I
wow.
went, why are we buying ice cream? We could make it whatever we want.
I know. What a find.
It's perfect. Next question. Book you're reading now.
I'm reading
On your bookshelf.
Shaniqua Walker Barnes. I'm reading actually two books. Shaniqua Walker Barnes, I Bring the Voices of My People, which is a womanist vision for racial work in the church. And then I'm also reading a book called The Brown Church, which is a survey of the Latinx church in Latin America and just the history of that. And so that's kind of been a really fascinating read as well.
Very good. Last show you binge watched.
Oh, I've been watching this show called Marcella. It's a British police procedural. It's brilliant. It's so good with
What's
Anna
that on?
Fail. It's on Netflix.
It's on Netflix? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'll look for that.
But it's on BBC too. So
Yeah.
Awesome.
And any other works that you're working on right now that you could give us a heads up on? Or
Give us a
Sure.
scoop. Give us a
Give us the scoop. We want to be the first to know.
big announcement on Vickers Crossing.
So I'm actually working on my second book, which is kind of tentatively titled The Sacred In-Between. So it's about liminality, the in-between space of uncertainty and discomfort, that sort of like Holy Saturday space,
Right.
Yeah.
which I think can be a space of tremendous growth, but also tremendous, the older we get, the less we like ambiguity and uncertainty, right? And yet these spaces are right for God to really work in us, because we're certain we don't want to do any work when we feel certain and right about things. So so that's what I'm writing about. Basically, it's a book about reconstructing faith, because lots of deconstruction going around, which is great.
Yep.
But if we don't reconstruct, then we're left without any faith. We're just critiquing the church outside of it.
So that Holy Saturday is sometimes referred to as the harrowing of hell, right? It's that it's a really powerful time of things sort of being, and it can be very numinous, liminal sort of expression, sort of what the Celts called the thin place, right? It's that place of how do we figure out what's holy and what's me, and how do I enter into that deep space, right? So glad you're writing that. I'm excited to get that. When will we get our mitts on it?
Next year. Probably next fall.
Okay.
Probably next fall or summer at the earliest.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have to have you back. We want to talk about that.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Karen, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Wish you all the best with the new book coming out. We'll look forward to that. Wish you safety and prayers of a blessing to you and your family. And we joke about it. We talk about it a lot, but we do pray for the country, for your leadership in these times. And we're good neighbors, and we want to continue that relationship as we move forward. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
And we have lots of other guests coming up in the next little while. Again, thanks to Karen. But next week, gentlemen, I've really been looking forward to talking to her about a few of his books, and he's coming on Tuesday, right? Who we got coming?
That's right, Tony Campolo, who is sort of began all this sort of shift in if you ask me, in the evangelical world towards a more open conversation. And so, you know, he back in the late 90s started writing stuff that really challenged some of the big evangelical churches to consider a broader perspective. Former counselor to President Clinton and so on. So we're really looking forward to him. And we also have Stephen Patterson coming on next week as well.
Right. So good.
Yeah.
So busy week next week, and we'll look forward to that. And where can people find us other than wherever they're watching now? I know we have some other.
Well, you're doing the YouTube, the Spotify, the SoundCloud, the Apple Podcast. You're all over the map. You know, you basically, if there's a place out there that produces podcasting, producer Ian has us on it. And so you should be sharing it with your friends. Our listenership is growing. We're very thankful to all these guests we have coming on. And we got a call coming in here. And this is caller number 4. You're on the air.
We are live. That's right.
So go to those places and check us out. And don't forget to visit our new webpage, www.thevicarscrossing.com, for all the latest news and our upcoming guests. And all the past episodes are on there as well.
Okay. Ian, stay out of trouble.
I'll try to.
All right. Get out of that room once in a while. Get a little air. All right. Work on the tan. Okay. Summertime.
Right.
And we want to say thanks, of course, to our sponsor, A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. So for Ian and for Kevy, I'm Rob. Take care. Thanks for being here. And remember, Kevin, to always look both ways.
Before you cross the street.
I'll do that.